Well, hello, everybody. Hello to the Sunshine State. I hope this Climate Conversations course has been enlightening for you. I'm honored to be joining you today. My name is Zach Brown. My background is in climate science. I spent years working on ice-breaking ships in the Arctic and Antarctic seas. So I'm a bipolar scientist, and I was very privileged to get to go to the ends of the earth. Since that time, I've moved more in the direction of climate education and climate activism, and that's what brings me to you today. Um, I'm beaming in from my home in Alaska, and I'm going to speak today about tackling the climate crisis. I wish we could do this in person. I'd love to see all your faces, to shake hands, interact, hear about your stories with climate change, but here we are, just going to have to do the best we can. So I'm going to turn my video off and I'm going to turn my PowerPoint on, and I'll see you at the end. Okay. Okay. Hope you all can see that all right. Taking action on the climate crisis. So as I'm sure you've been learning, the hour is very late in the climate crisis. Climate change has arrived. We're seeing devastating impacts now, from wildfires engulfing the western US to the record-breaking hurricane season in the Atlantic. As Greta Thunberg puts it, our house is on fire. So I hope that the big question on your minds is, what can I do? There's an awful lot of focus on individual and personal action, like changing light bulbs, driving less, buying local food. These are great things to do, but the problem is they imply that we as individuals are to blame for the climate crisis, that we are broken, we are behaving badly, and we have to fix ourselves. This is my key message for you. It's time to turn the blame frame around. So let's start here. Let's shift the blame for the climate crisis where it belongs. Self-blame is paralyzing. When we see ourselves as the one to blame for causing global warming, what are we supposed to do about it? Just berate ourselves, live in despair? Over the next few slides, I hope to dismantle the myth of individual responsibility for the climate crisis. And that's going to help us see how to take actually effective action. When it comes to personal action and personal responsibility, there was a very important paper that came out in Science a few years ago by Elise Amel and her colleagues. They're environmental psychologists, which I think is really cool. And what they imagined was an individual person who's looking to do their part to help change the world for the better. But because it's more interesting and more fun to be specific rather than general, I'm going to pick on Tiffany, who I think you all know. Tiffany told me that one thing she likes to do to reduce her carbon footprint is eat less red meat. And there's no doubt about it, red meat has serious impact on the climate. So Amel and colleagues defined these various spheres of influence a person like Tiffany can have. The first is the private and personal. This is the classic reduce, reuse, recycle level of action. For Tiffany, it means eating less red meat. Let's say she cuts down to just once a week, and that's great. But maybe Tiffany wants to think a little bigger. She might look to this next circle and encourage her friends and neighbors to eat less meat too. Maybe she'll help her neighbor shop for more veggies and learn some vegetarian recipes. But that might not be enough. She might even move to the next level and actually start a community organization dedicated to eating less red meat. They could start a co-op to sell locally grown veggies, do a public education campaign about how red meat contributes to global warming. And if that wasn't enough, now Tiffany decides to run for state Congress in Florida on the Eat Less Red Meat platform. And when she wins, she's going to introduce legislation that everyone in Florida has to eat less red meat. Red meat is outlawed. Vegetarianism becomes the law of the land. And eventually, after Tiffany does enough work and spreads the vegetable gospel, we reach the biggest sphere of influence, which is cultural. This is when we don't need a law on the books forcing us to eat less red meat, because of course we're going to eat vegetarian. That's our culture. Our very foundations as a society is about eating vegetables. So if you eat red meat, you're not part of our tribe and you can leave. We're vegetable people. But the most revealing thing about this diagram is that they put an axis on it. Notice the axis goes from smallest impact at the top to largest impact at the bottom. And what it shows is that personal action is the smallest level of impact we can have. If we want to fix climate change, personal action cannot be all that we aspire to. This is a global, systemic problem that requires global, systemic solutions. Think about this. Do you think fossil fuel executives, like from Exxon or Shell, are operating in the private and personal level up at the top? Do you think they're getting into their boardrooms and saying, okay, here's our strategy for growing the industry, fellas. We're going to use more fossil fuels as individuals. We're going to drive more and fly more and eat more red meat as individuals. And that's going to increase demand for fossil fuels just a little bit. And that's going to make our companies more profitable. You think that's how they're operating? Hell no. I'll tell you the levels where the fossil fuel industry is operating. They're operating where the real power is. They're operating on the public level, influencing elections through campaign donations, fueling voter suppression efforts, gaining political appointments like Scott Pruitt in the EPA or Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. And they're operating at the cultural level, funding a sustained campaign to create a culture that distrusts science, and advertising to create a culture where to be a man, you have to drive a V8 350 truck and eat a big steak every night. So if we're stuck up here at the private and personal level, wailing about our own carbon footprint, and they're down there where the real power is, the system will stay just as it is. We'll stay mired in the status quo. That's why touting individual action to ourselves, to our friends and families, is actually a huge disservice because it's a false tool. What I tell my students is, by all means, do these things that reduce your dependence on fossil fuels. Ride your bike, grow a garden, get to know your local farmer, eat less red meat. But don't do these things because they'll fix the climate crisis. They won't. Do them because these are the things that tend to make us happy and healthy. Ride your bike because you can hear the birds when you do. Grow a garden because, as my friend Hank says, worms are groovy creatures. Eat less red meat because instead of buying a dead cellophane wrapped thing with no story, you can instead have a good conversation with your local farmer. Then go out and fix the climate crisis through collective action that's actually effective. See, this is what the fossil fuel industry wants us to believe, that it's our fault and that the only way to solve the problem is to change ourselves. Because as long as we believe that, we'll stay up here on this ineffective level trying to change as individuals without changing the system. And they can keep right on drilling, buying off politicians, and funding climate change denial. And I'm not just speculating that that's what the fossil fuel industry wants us to think. They've spent millions to convince us to blame ourselves. This piece details how the whole concept of the carbon footprint is a fossil fuel industry invention. It was conjured up by BP in 2005 in a $100 million ad campaign. And here's what that ad campaign looked like. Look at how they shift the blame. They're talking about your mark on the world, CO2 emitted due to your daily activities. And meanwhile, they're pretending to call themselves Beyond Petroleum, even as they continue to lobby the government and fight tooth and nail against any policies to reduce the systemic addiction to fossil fuels. Look at how they end. It's a start. And they know that it's only a start, that if we buy into this self-blame, it will make us totally ineffective at solving this crisis because it'll divert our eyes from the big picture. This is where it's at. I work in the environmental movement. I don't care if you recycle. Take on the oil and gas industry instead. Mary Higlar is one of our best environmental writers, and she's right. She's exactly right. Our fixation on our own actions diverts our eyes from the big picture and prohibits us from making real change. Now, here's the other thing, is that coronavirus has provided the biggest proof to date that personal action simply doesn't work. Take a look at this headline. Because of the pandemic, greenhouse gas emissions could fall as much as 8% this year. That would be the biggest year-to-year drop in emissions ever, and the media went nuts about how historic this is. But that's not the real story. The real story is, why is the drop so small? Our world is totally transformed by the pandemic, isn't it? Around the world, we've been dropping our personal carbon footprints like crazy. We're not getting on planes, we're not getting in cars, we're not getting on cruise ships, and yet the projected drop is only 8%. The real story of coronavirus and climate change is the severe limitations to personal action. If our lives are completely transformed and global emissions only drop 8%, that's all the proof you need that we've been misled for decades about how to fix this thing. How can the change be that small? Because carbon emissions are systemic. They've been built into the very fabric of our society, and a very strong web of power structures holds that in place. So, not only does the carbon footprint concept put the blame in the wrong place and distract us from the big picture, it doesn't even work. This is the takeaway from Bill McKibben, perhaps our greatest living climate champion, certainly one of them. This is the most common question he receives as one of our most dedicated climate activists. What can I, as an individual, do about climate change? He gives a simple answer: become less of an individual. What does it look like for an individual to join a movement to take on an unjust system? I'm going to point you to a few of the tools the climate movement has in their toolbox. The great thing is there are real tools for collective action, and they're happening now, and they're readily available. Once we dig a little deeper into this, we can understand that the answers to fixing the climate crisis are much simpler than we've been led to believe. It really comes down to just one thing: taking the fossil fuel industry out of power. The first tool I'll mention is divestment. This is possibly the best place for young people, especially students, to plug into the movement. Divestment means that organizations are pulling their investments and endowments out of the fossil fuel industry, reinvesting them elsewhere. To date, over 1,000 organizations, that's all over the spectrum, religious organizations, cities and towns, nonprofits, and especially colleges and universities, have pulled their money out of fossil fuels. Over $14 trillion worth of assets have divested from fossil fuels. So this is not fringe, this is mainstream. And along the way, it has called huge attention to climate change and catalyzed a whole generation of young people to get involved in this movement. Divestment is being spearheaded by today's students. The goal of the divestment movement is not so much to defund the fossil fuel industry, although $14 trillion in portfolios is a lot of money, but it's more to take a moral stand against climate change. These students are saying, hey, it's morally wrong and hypocritical for colleges and universities to tout a message of preparing their students to thrive in the future, while at the same time investing in an industry that's actively destroying that future. That's a powerful argument. It chips away at the social license of the fossil fuel companies. Individuals like you can pull your money out of the fossil fuel industry. And it's good practice, not just from a climate standpoint, but from a financial standpoint too. Energy is the worst performing sector on the stock market for the last 2 years, and 2020 is likely to be even worse. Did you see when the price of a barrel of oil fell to negative $37 back in April? It's awful tough to make a profit at those prices. So ExxonMobil just fell out of the S&P 500 top 10 list for the first time in history. Their stock is falling. You better get your dollars out while you can. But better even than doing it as an individual is doing it as a group, as part of the movement. So for those of you who went to college, oh, yeah, right, energy stocks, a black eye on the S&P 500 again. Their stock is falling. But doing it as a group, for those of you who went to college or say who regularly go to church, take a look at whether your alma mater or your church is still investing in the fossil fuel industry. It's 2020, people. Investing in the fossil fuel industry with all that we now know is investing in the destruction of the planet, period. Every college and university in the country has a divestment movement. Check it out and see what you can do to help these brave students fight this good fight. Here's another tool: finance. Going after the finance industry. Finance is the newest front of the climate wars. As Bill McKibben puts it, money is the oxygen that fuels the climate crisis. Take away their financing, and the fossil fuel industry can't operate anymore. The preeminent group, which has just risen to prominence within the last year, is called Stop the Money Pipeline. They have particularly targeted Chase Bank, which has lent fossil fuels $196 billion since the Paris Climate Accord was signed in December 15, December 2015. So it goes without saying that this is inconsistent with the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. They are financing climate destruction, plain and simple, and so are the other big banks. That has to stop. How else are people confronting the fossil fuel industry? Blockadia is a general term for people taking direct action to stop the reckless extraction. In some cases, it's motivated by climate change. In most cases, it's motivated by people simply defending their homeland from being strip mined and poisoned by the fossil fuel industry. You don't hear much about this on the evening news, but protesters are blockading every single new piece of fossil fuel infrastructure that is ever proposed. Every pipeline, every power plant, every coal mine. Most of these battles they still lose. The power of the industry is just too great to stop. But increasingly, these protesters are winning David versus Goliath battles. As just one example of hundreds I could cite of the beautiful power of protest, you have the kayaktivists in the port of Seattle blockading the Polar Pioneer from heading up to the Arctic. And ultimately, that investment was dropped after $5 billion of wasted for a variety of reasons, including the negative press that this reckless extraction brought to Shell. And I've done my time protesting against Shell's plans to drill in the Arctic, a place that I love. We scientists are some of the only people to ever go there. If we don't defend it, who will? So these are a few tools, but this year, what's the biggest thing we can be doing to join the climate movement? Get political. I don't think I have to spend too much breath trying to convince you how important it is to defeat Donald Trump. And as most of you know, you are in perhaps the most important state for making that happen. No Republican has won the presidency without winning Florida since 1924. That was Calvin Coolidge. Florida is the crucial state. If Biden wins Florida, he wins the election. The choice could not be starker. The Trump administration is totally focused on climate destruction, from pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord to giving billions in bailouts to the fossil fuel industry during COVID. Just look at all these environmental rollbacks. I could go through a gigantic list. Now, Joe Biden, on the other hand, has the most ambitious climate platform of any presidential nominee in history. So, if you want to make the biggest possible difference in the climate crisis, spend the next 40 days doing everything you possibly can to help Joe Biden carry Florida. This is a chance that we won't get back again. If he carries Florida, he wins, and if he wins, we can turn things around. It will be monumental for our global climate future. How best to help Joe Biden win Florida? I don't have a perfect answer for that. I'm not a political strategist. I suggest getting in touch with the campaign, signing up as a volunteer. And then there are tons of other ways. This is one that I've been working with. Vote Forward allows you to send letters to voters, encouraging them to get out and vote. This is a really easy thing to do. You just print them off, you write a little message, stick it in the mail, and you could help as many as hundreds of people go to the polls. How about this one? If you don't know the story, Florida voters in 2018 voted to enfranchise hundreds of thousands of felons who had been convicted of nonviolent crimes and had served their time. But in typical Republican voter suppression fashion, the Republican-controlled legislature then took it upon itself to disenfranchise those voters again by forcing them to pay off their fees to the government before they could vote, which amounts to a modern-day poll tax. Most of these felons can't afford to pay those fees, so Mike Bloomberg and others, donating through the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, have come in to pay off those fees for them. This is an effort you could get involved with. Pay someone's fees so that they can vote. And there are 100 other ways to help Biden win Florida. So, stop share, restart my video here. It's good to see y'all again. Let me just pull up my notes. So thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me today. Let's go out and make change. As of the time of this recording, we have 40 days until the biggest election of our lives. Let's make them count. What would you do if you knew the fate of the biosphere and human civilization hung on the balance for the next 40 days? Because it does. Signing off from Alaska, Thanks a lot.